Welcome everybody to this third event at the Petersham Bowling Club for Readers, Books and Conversation. We're really, really thrilled that you are here this evening. My name is Michaela Kalowski and we're very lucky to be joined this evening by Jodi McAlister, all the way from Melbourne, via Kiama. But I have to say, Jodi is no stranger to the Petersham Bowling Club. She informed me that she celebrated her 30th birthday here very recently. I want to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to welcome any First Nations people who are joining us tonight or who will be watching tonight because we're recording as well. Jodi and I are going to speak in the traditional way for 45 minutes, and then we've got a lovely roving microphone that will come around for your wonderful questions, so keep them in mind as we're going along. Books are for sale at the back at the lovely table that you've seen, so you can buy many, many copies and brag to your friends that you were here this evening. We'd love that. What I want to do now before we dive in is introduce Jodi to you because she's very impressive, and I'm going to read her whole bio. She is the author of romantic fiction for adults and young adults, as well as being an academic. Her academic work focuses on the history of love, sex, women and girls, popular culture and fiction. It means that reading romance novels and watching The Bachelor is technically work for her. In her author's life, she's the author of the Valentine Series, a young adult paranormal romance urban fantasy series about smart girls, small towns and scary fairies. Those books are Valentine, Ironheart and Misrule. She's also the author of Libby Lawrence is Good at Pretending, which was published last year, which is a young adult contemporary romance with university-age characters, published by Wakefield Press. She says it's about a lot of things, but mostly it's about kids who love theatre, having too many emotions. Jodi wrote the first draft of that book when she was a theatre kid too, with many emotions, so it's very close to her heart. But she's recently started writing for adults in the rom-com genre, which is mostly what we're going to be talking about this evening. Her debut in this space is called Here for the Right Reasons. That was out in July of last year, and she's extremely busy because she's just published the second book in that series, which is called Can I Steal You for a Second, which we'll talk about, which is on sale here. And she's also currently writing the third in that series as well. These books are set on the same season of a reality dating show, actually different seasons of a reality dating show, where in a massive twist, because COVID is happening, the contestants kind of can check out anytime they like, but they can never leave. So it's about the unlikely romances that take place there, and we'll talk about that too. As I mentioned, Jodi's originally from Kiama, a seaside holiday town on the south coast of New South Wales, but she's lived in a bunch of different cities. In Canberra, where she did her undergraduate degrees, in Wollongong, where she lived and did her PhD, then in Sydney, and in Hobart, which is where she held her first academic job, and she's currently in Melbourne, where she's a senior lecturer in writing and literature at Deakin University. I have to say as well that we will talk tonight. We're going to do something a bit unusual, which is that we have this author of two sets of series of books. We've got so many things we can talk about, but it's a bit of a rare treat to have an expert in romance, but an academic of Jodi's standing here with us tonight, and I really want to ask her to delve into a whole lot of things about why we love reading about love and how we know what we're reading and how those kinds of books and stories have changed over time. I should tell you though as background that her first academic book was called The Consummate Virgin, which is about representations of female virginity loss in popular culture. In 2015, she have to also tell you that she was invited to visit the set of The Bold and the Beautiful.
It's the best thing that's ever happened to me in my whole life.
It's true, it's true.
But I got a PhD and a book deal that year and it's still the best thing. And I had my 30th birthday party at the Petersham Bowling Club.
Exactly. So now I think you know everything you need to know, really. And we're going to dive in. So, Jodi, I want to start by asking you about, we've said you're an academic, you research in romance and romance fiction. Firstly, how and why did that become your area?
So there are a few reasons for this. So I always knew that I wanted to go back to university after I did my undergraduate. But I thought I was going to be an early modernist. So I wrote my honours thesis, which I loved very dearly, on kind of the complicated female characters in the work of a playwright called Thomas Middleton, who's kind of like Shakespeare, but like edgier. Like they tried to rebrand Middleton about 15 years ago as like Shakespeare's cool cousin with like an earring and tattoos, and he's not quite that cool, but like he writes really interesting women. So I thought I was going to be a scholar of Renaissance theatre. And then I got a job because doing a PhD, even if you're on scholarship, you are below the poverty line. So I was like, I need to go and make myself a little nest egg. And I went to work in the public service, and no shade to any public servants here in the room, but I hated it. I was miserable. And one of the ways I started coping with this is I would go to Big W or Target on my lunch break, and I would pick up the Mills and Boons. Now, this wasn't my first tango with Mills and Boon. It's one of the first romance novels I ever read. I used to steal my grandma's Mills and Boon. It's a common origin story, I think, for a lot of romance readers. Yeah. Whenever someone says not your grandma's romance, I can tell you from personal experience, but also a lot of study, that you don't know what your grandma was reading if you use that phrase. But I was fascinated with why I was just churning through these Mills and Boon, and I was like, oh, what if this actually? Am I allowed to study this? Mm. And I realized that there was a very, very nascent body of scholarship on this. It was very new, very small. And one of the things you look for when you're doing as a PhD is, what's the gap? Where can I make a contribution? And everyone and their mum has written about Renaissance theatre, which I'm still interested in to this day. But romance fiction, I was so fascinated by it. Mm. Hardly anyone had written about it, though more people do now. We have a whole association, the International Association for the Study of Popular Romance, of which I am the vice president. There's an ascent. But I was fascinated by the question of what people actually read. And the question that has defined my whole scholarly career is, what are the stories we tell about love, and what do they do to the ways that we think? How do they affect our lives? Because the way that we live our lives so often is governed by the stories we tell ourselves. So that intertwining of story and thought process has always fascinated me, and I think will fascinate me till the day I die, because academics don't retire. You might become an emeritus professor, but you don't leave the Academy's Hotel California.
I love it. I love it. So, as you've just said, we all experience love, we all yearn for love, and it turns out a lot of us are reading about it. And I wanted to ask you two things. Why do we love reading about it? As you said, what is it we get out of reading about it? But also, and I think it's a fair thing to say at the outset, why is it such a maligned genre?
Yeah, so there are a few things going on here. So I'm going to get a little bit academic here, and I have to ask you to do something for me. If I say the word discourse, I've gone too far into nerd, and you have to yell at me and make me stop.
Is there a word is like a safe word they need to yell at you?
No, they just need to go, wah! Okay. If I say discourse, I've started delivering a lecture, which is not the vibe here at the Petersham Bowling Club. No. But the philosopher Simon May, who wrote a very good book about love, argues that love has become religion in the Western world in the 20th and 21st centuries. We have, in some ways, replaced kind of the ideas of faith in God with love. Love is the thing that we believe in. Love is the thing we want to return to. Love is the thing that we hold in highest esteem. And so no wonder we are fascinated by it, because media is saturated by it. Turn on the radio, listen to any song. It's almost certainly about love. I'm trying to think of a counterexample, and what I'm coming up with is Gangnam Style, which is a very out-of-date
something
reference.
Else, really. Yeah.
Mbop? I don't know. But we are fascinated by love, and it happens. What am I trying to say? So love is this thing that is very, very individual between two people, or more people in a kind of polyamorous situation. But we imagine it as a couple, and we imagine the couple as the building block of the family. This is sorry, I'm going to break my own rule immediately. Discursive, which is discourse but an adjective. No. Discursive shift that happened in Western history in the 18th and 19th century, where we stopped imagining love as destructive and started imagining it as constructive, as companionate marriage became the ideal, as opposed to marrying for dynastic reasons or familial reasons or whatever. That's a subject I can talk about for a really long time, so if anyone has any questions about that, we can talk about that later. But we imagine the family as the building block of the nation, and we imagine the romantic relationship as the building block of the family. So love is encoded into cultural structures in a way that we often don't really think about. And it's also one of the term, it's a narrative term, but I think it's really useful, it's one of the master plots by which we live our lives. And so if you look at a lot of the language we use around love, it's often very narrative language, and it's couched in terms of passing and failing a lot of the time. So the master plot is a narrative that we all kind of know instinctively. A good example of a master plot is the narrative of university. Like, you go to university, you study hard, you get a good job, and then you are successful and make money forever. That definitely happens to everyone all the time. And so when that doesn't happen to you, you feel disappointed because you feel like you haven't lived up to the master plot. There is no master plot more pervasive in Western culture than the romantic master plot, which is, you know, you meet someone, you like them, you fall in love, you sleep together, you get married, you have children. You might not do all of those milestones, and you might do them out of order, like you might have children before you get married or something. You might, you know, you might not have children, you might not get married, but roughly that trajectory is the same. And so when we kind of tap out of that master plot at some point, say when you experience a breakup, there's a sense not just of failure, but also that you have to go back to the beginning, which is a really narrative concept. So studying stories and love seems really, really natural to me because the ways we think are shaped by stories, and I don't know if any is quite so powerful to us than Simon May's Love is a Religion. That romantic master plot is so, so pervasive and affects the ways that we think in a way that we might not even realize a lot of the time.
Totally. So as you say, if it's so pervasive and it's so the bedrock of how we think about our lives, every aspect of our lives and the choices we make, why, when we talk about this genre, because we are here for a books conversation as well, when we think about books in this genre, for the most part, we really write them off. You know, I know heaps of people who say, oh, when I told them we were doing this tonight, I went, oh, I read romance. You know, they were almost ashamed to say that they read it. And that's a subset of people, or I've gone into bookshops myself, little good independent bookshops, who are like, oh no, we don't stock those books here. You know, that kind of thing. And I'm wondering, why is it a genre as well, to come back to that question, that is so maligned? What's going on if it's so central to how all of us navigate the world?
Yeah, so the answer to that last question was very complicated. This one's pretty simple. You might have heard of a thing called sexism.
Walk us through that.
Yeah, if you haven't heard of that one, no, I'm pretty sure you all know about sexism. This isn't quite as true as maybe once it was, but one of the perceptions around romance has been by women for women. Now, I don't want to say that that is necessarily true, because that is not entirely true anymore, particularly with the emergence of LGBTQIA+ romances, but still that is the way romance is perceived. And turns out, if things are targeted towards women, culture likes to shit all over them.
Right.
So a classic example is screaming fangirls of the Beatles or of One Direction. If media is of interest to women, particularly young women, but women more broadly, culturally we tend to assume that it's not good, really. And also there's a kind of thought paradigm that dates long back in Western culture, that men are rational and women are emotional, and of course love is an emotion. And so these come out, you know, in the kind of sociocultural paradigm on the wrong side of that coin. I do think this is starting to shift a little bit, and there are many reasons behind this, but one that I think is most fascinating at the moment is the popularity of books, but particularly romance books on TikTok. And one of the biggest shifts that I've seen there, as someone who studies this space, but especially as someone who writes in this space, is that people who might not be romance readers can sometimes name individual romance novels now, where previously if someone came up to me and was like, oh, romances are terrible, I'd be like, oh, have you read one? Name one. And they never could. Now they can, so I've lost my gotcha question. So really this is just hard for me personally.
I'm sure with your mind you will find a new gotcha question.
Yeah.
I want to get into some of the tropes of romance novels. When we talk about Jodi's more recent ones, Can I Steal You for a Second, with her latest one, and Here for the Right Reasons, I think you describe them as rom-coms.
Yeah.
But if we're just sticking with romance for a moment, what are the big tropes when we come to romance that when I start reading that book, either that I know it, when I see it, I'm like, oh, I'm reading a romance novel, or that I expect it?
Yeah. So let's start with the kind of mandatory ones, and then the ones that kind of define a book rather than the genre. So you only need two things to be a romance novel. And this is according to the Romance Writers of America, but most romance organizations around the world have taken on this definition or some version of this definition, which is that a romance novel needs to, the A plot rather than a subplot, needs to be a love story. So it can't be like, oh, this is really a space heist with a romantic plot over here in the corner. That's not necessarily a romance novel. But if your space heist is mostly about like two sexy space pirates falling in love, probably a romance novel. And the other thing it must have...
I want to read that, by the way.
I'm sure that exists. I can't tell you precisely what it... Oh, no.
It's Hunt the Stars.
Yeah, it's Jessie Mahal.
Yeah. Just at the end, she's going to give us some recommendations.
Yeah,
so
Jessie
get your
Mahal
pens
is
ready.
on my list. Yeah. And the other thing it must have is what the Romance Writers of America calls an emotionally satisfying and optimistic ending. I can never remember if it's emotionally optimistic or satisfying. It's got those three words in it. They mean happy ending, but they worded it that way because they wanted to include Gone with the Wind, which now everyone I think mostly agrees is not a romance novel, and also you probably shouldn't read anymore because it's so racist.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the reason it's worded that way. But basically, it's got to be mostly about love, and it's got to end happily. If it's a Nicholas Sparks, for example, which is mostly about love, but everyone dies at the end, and it's very sad, and everyone cries, that's just a Nicholas Sparks novel. That's not a romance novel.
Yeah, it's a whole other category.
Yeah. But within everyone, there's a perception that romance novels are all the same, but literally those are the only two rules. And even if you know where you're going to end up, which is that everything will turn out all right in the end. That is the great promise of romance. You don't necessarily know how you're going to get there. And so you can get there however you want, really, but there are a lot of kind of smaller tropes that are very common. So if I use my own books as an example, Both Here for the Right Reasons and Can I Steal You for a Second, and Not Here to Make Friends, which is the third one, which will be out in December, are what we would call forced proximity novels, where two characters are forced into some kind of confined space. In this case, it's a reality TV set, but other examples of this might be snowed in somewhere, or you're on a desert island, or anywhere where you're confined to a space. These two are also both friends to lovers novels, which I'm sure you can all work out what that means. Another variety of this is enemies to lovers, which is the dynamic that's at play in my Valentine series, where you start off disliking each other and you realize, oh, maybe that dislike was something else actually. And then there are so many romance tropes. Like a classic one is There's Only One Bed, which is a variety of forced proximity where you have to share a hotel room, and guess what, guys?
Yeah.
It's only one bed.
Crazy.
One that I have seen describe Can I Steal You for a Second quite a lot is Who Did This to You? Where one character asks the other that, with the flip side is I'll look after you, which is itself a variety of hurt comfort. A lot of this language actually comes from fan fiction, interestingly. So we could talk about tropes all night. There are 1,000,001. But if you work out through romance reading which ones you like, you can kind of gravitate to them a little bit more. So maybe you really, really like friends to lovers. You're like, yes, give me some of that. But you hate fake dating, and you can stay away from that. And so forth.
We're going to get into trends in a moment as well, because a lot of trends both in this genre and in other genres that I want to get Jodi to talk to us about. But I do want to stick to something that you wrote your PhD on, which is this idea of representations of female virginity loss in popular culture. What's the she must be a virgin part of romance stories? I know, obviously, when you talk about the foundational stuff of the dynastic marriage and all the other things, we have those views about men could do whatever they want, but women have to be pure. But why did that remain until, I was picking up Mills and Boons in the, late 80s, and that was still such a central part of the story? Yeah, so it still happens, the virgin heroine, but it's definitely not as ubiquitous as once it was. I think now, I haven't really dived into virginity study for quite some years now, because I graduated in 2015, but a lot of the virgins you'd see now are often in dark romance, where a lot of the tropes are very, very heightened, and so they tend to gravitate towards extremes more than, say, a contemporary rom-com would. But, we can talk about virginity in romance novels all night, my friends, but often it was about the idea of being looked after by someone, of someone valuing you. But it also became a guarantee in some ways. You saw this a lot in Harlequins, where the hero had sex with the heroine and then you knew they were going to end up together because he'd taken her virginity. Also because sleeping with the heroine kind of gave him feelings as like an STI. I hate it when that happens.
That's a trope that comes up in a lot of romance novels, but especially virgin romance novels. He's like, oh, I've achieved my goal of sleeping with this girl. I thought I would get it out of my system, but it's more in my system now. There's a whole kind of complicated gender and sexual politics going on. Like one arm of romance scholarship and romance discourse that was happening particularly. Oh no!
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you for checking me. Romance conversations.
This is my favourite kind of audience participation, I have to say.
Discussions around romance. Shit, what was I saying? What was I saying? What was I talking about?
We were just talking about...
I was talking about conversations about romance.
Yeah.
What was happening in the conversations about romance? We were talking about virgins.
We're talking about virgins, and we're talking about that changing a little bit.
Yes.
Men getting feelings from sex.
Men getting feelings from sex.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ooh.
We can come back to it.
Yeah, I've completely lost my train of thought.
Because they yelled at you. I want to come on to something. I'm going to give it to you now. It's not coming up just yet, but I'm going to give you a language warning, which I love to do in a conversation about romance books. Because at some point there may be a subsection of books that you're going to hear about through Jodi, which involves milking minotaurs.
Yeah.
So we're going to get there. We're going to get there.
Specifically, I asked if I was allowed to say the word monster fucker.
Because that is a whole category. So we were going to get there. But before we get to monster fuckers, we're going to talk about bonk busters.
Yeah.
So we go from Mills and Boon into the 1970s and the 1980s, well into the 1980s, and we're in...
Oh, I remember what I was talking about.
Oh, here
Sorry.
we go. Let's go back.
Romance and
help.
Complicated gender and sexual politics. There was a big, big movement in discussions about romance happening in scholarship, but also in social media, about how romance novels were totally feminist texts and they were feminist all the time because they were by women for women. And I think we have now started to acknowledge that the reality is a little bit more complicated.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to say that romance novels are not feminist, because I think in many cases that they are, but it's not as simple as saying romance is inherently a feminist genre, because I don't think anything can be inherently a feminist genre. You can argue that feminist readings can be... Anyway, that's a literally theory, debate, discourse. But I think we're starting to recognise the complexity in that a lot more. And that's something I thought a lot about when I was researching virgins, because so much regressive sexual politic was bound up with them, particularly when I was studying, this is why Bonkbusters made me think of it, when I was studying books from the 70s and 80s, these books were taking place, like they were written and being published against the backdrop of second wave feminism. And they were reacting to many of the same issues, and women were clearly getting so much out of them. Like, a classic piece of scholarship on romance is Reading the Romance by Janice Radway, which came out from 1984, very flawed piece of scholarship, which is, it's a second wave piece of feminist scholarship where she interviewed romance readers, and they were like, yeah, we actually get a ton out of these books. And as this feminist scholar, she was like, why though? And so I think we've come back to the, like, scholarship was originally romance is anti-feminist, and then there was a wave of no, romance is totally feminist, and now we're like, it can be quite complicated, but what is most interesting is that these books create pleasure in their readerships, and that pleasure is what is most interesting. That was a complicated thought. Thanks for going with me on that journey.
She got there.
Sorry to cut you off about Bonkbusters.
I love it. So what I was going to say, I want to move us through this kind of, the history of romance a little bit before we get to Jodi stuff, which is that we've gone from Mills and Boon and Harlequin and depictions you were talking about that predate all of that, to the Bonkbusters of the 70s, the 80s, which are the Jilly Coopers, the Judith Krantzes, the Jackie Collinses. And these are books, as Jodi told me, that sold, upward of like 500 million copies a book, right? But we just didn't really think they were very important or very special, or there was nothing unique about them because women read them. So I know, Jodi, you said you're doing some research into this. So talk to us about the importance of Bonkbusters and kind of where they were going and what they did. And are they romance novels?
So they are not romance novels, in my assessment. They are often lumped together with romance novels, but I think because they're by women, predominantly read by women, and often a lot of the branding was quite romance adjacent. But these books are often very anti-romantic in their outlook, I think. They're much more like soap opera because they have ensemble casts and kind of a revolving door of relationships, and they have bad sex in them in a way that romance novels don't really. Some of them are quite traumatizing to read, honestly. I've just been rereading for research Lace by Shelley Conran. And famous for the iconic line, "Which one of you bitches is my mother?" Which my colleague and I are going to use as the title of our book about Bonk.
Fantastic.
Has a very disturbing scene involving a goldfish that I will not describe further. But,
a goldfish warning. Now we need a goldfish warning.
yeah, there's a trigger warning no one ever thought that they need. Right. So these books are fascinating. They're often sometimes described as sex and shopping books because they're a lot of conspicuous consumption. But if you've never read one, to get a flavour of them, they're like Dynasty. They're like Dallas. The shoulder pads are high. There's lots of descriptions of outfits that are fabulously 80s. And one of the things my colleague at the University of Birmingham and I are really interested in is where they went. And what we're kind of thinking at the moment, although noting this is really early days for this research, is they became reality television.
Yes.
Specifically the Real Housewives,
Yeah.
but like the Kardashians owe a lot to this. Not so much the like Eliminator style dating shows that I'm writing about in Here for the Right Reasons, but that same sense of spectacle and excess and adultery is very much present in reality television, and there's a lot of scholarship to suggest that the kind of kickoff of reality television in the early 2000s was the beginning of the end for the daytime soap. Like we went from having 19 American soap operas on the air to only 4 remain today.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating generic shift. We're really early days in this research, but it's so cool and interesting. Yeah. Even if I had to like read that goldfish scene, which is never going to leave my mind.
So, you know, we're talking about the way as well that these different tropes have kind of evolved throughout through these books throughout over many decades. And I'm kind of wondering when we think about, when I was thinking about our conversation tonight and I think about things I read when I was, 12 or 15 or 20, they do not age well. When you pick up those books now, you're like, oh, coercive control, oh, abuse, or like massive power imbalances either between a man and a woman or about age or about money.
Yeah, reading Bonkbusters now is a real journey.
Yeah, eye-opener. And I guess I'm wondering, it's not about, we want everything we read, we want things to hook us in, to be engaging. I don't need things to be bland. But I'm wondering if these books have reflected social mores, how are the books that are being written now in this space changing? What are they reflecting? What are they showing us about where we're up to? Yeah,
so I think one of the first mistakes people make when they, kind of come into romance spaces and they say they want to write like a 750-word think piece about it, is they assume they are what we would call mimetic, in that they directly represent what people want. There is something much more complicated and metaphorical going on, I think. So, for example, dark romance is a huge genre at the moment. It's very, very popular. I think it's pretty safe to say that readers of dark romance do not actually wish for the things that happen in dark romance to happen to them. You can probably guess from the name dark romance that these books are... There's some stuff in them, my goodness. But often, this is something I saw with virginity stories as well, often just that kind of element of fantasy like scratches a mental itch, because on the page it's safe, on the page you're safe, but you can kind of experience these emotions, vicariously is the wrong word, but you can experience them in this safe space over here. There's fences around them, whereas in the real world that would not be the same thing. So we can never assume that what people like in books is what they want in real life. It just scratches some animal itches in our brains sometimes.
I like it. When we were talking about trends in romance, and I mentioned before that we'll do some recommendations. What have been some of the trends that have happened, say, in the last sort of 10 years?
Yeah. Well, dark romance is one. This is where we get to talk about monster fuckers.
There we go. Language warning. Yeah.
How many of you have heard of Ice Planet Barbarians?
There's a few hands.
A few hands. But not a lot.
Yeah.
Allow me to explain. This started off as 2015 is the first Ice Planet Barbarians books, when I was here having my 30th birthday party at the Petersham Bowling Club and getting invited to the set of The Bold and the Beautiful. Banner year this year. It started off as a self-published series I think it was through Kindle Unlimited. It definitely turned into Kindle Unlimited. Online, on the internet, of quite short romances between various human heroines who were kidnapped from Earth by some bad aliens, and then through various shenanigans got... What's the space version of shipwrecked? space wrecked.
Space wrecked.
On an ice planet. And guess who they met there was some barbarians who are 7 foot tall and blue. And if you ever want to see something amusing, go and look at the original covers of these, because they're just stock photos of tall, handsome men who have been turned blue and put big horns on their head. And there's one novella that's called, I think, Ice Babies, about these half blue alien babies. And it's just a baby and they turn it blue, give it little horns. It's one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life. Thank you, Ruby Dixon, for giving us this gift. But this series took off. And the psychology, I think, behind Ice Planet Barbarians and behind a lot of monster fucker romance, where monsters aren't just like vampires. Werewolf, I think, is kind of the crossover point, but we're talking like dragons and krakens and
giant squid,
tentacle people. Gargoyles are apparently really big at the moment. They often have a humanoid form and then transform into something monstrous. But they're specifically non-human and they're horrified by the behavior of human men. And that is, I think, what a lot of the appeal is. It's, I mean, some of it is like, let's fuck a monster.
Right.
But also is like, wow, human men are really disappointing in many ways. Like, the blue aliens are horrified to hear about the concept of rape, for instance. They're like, no, we would never. That concept doesn't exist in our culture. If someone did that, they would fall down the ice well, or I can't remember the exact terminology, but it would not go well for them.
Yeah.
And there's a real pleasure in that, and that is, I think, where that trend stemmed from. It really, really took off in the era of Me Too. And correlation is not causation, of course, but I do think that there's something very suggestive about that correlation. And then also rom-coms. We can argue that the rom-com boom took off in probably 2016 with Sally Thorne's The Hating Game, but it really took off in 2020 when Book Talk became a really, really big thing. And why wouldn't we want to read something like light and funny where everything turns out in the end in an era of incredible uncertainty? Like, that is the promise of romance, is that everything will turn out all right in the end. And this pattern has been repeated through literary history. And my favourite example of this is that during World War II, Mills and Boon was the only publisher that maintained their paper ration on the grounds that it was great for morale for women in the factories. And Mills and Boon novels in the 40s very, very rarely featured the war. They were often there was a lot of desert island romance in that point. They were just very escapist, or they were really, really domestic. And they were just this whole other world that women could read and go back to work. And having that comfort, that promise that it's going to be okay, why wouldn't we gravitate to that in a time of uncertainty? That pleasure is so obvious.
We're talking about the things that are the markers that make a book romance or rom-com, but I'm kind of wondering, because we have an academic here on stage, whether the same can be, in this series we opened with a non-fiction author back in February. Last month we did crime fiction, so we're sort of moving between genres. And then we talked before about how certain genres like romance are still maligned, but I'm wondering if is it safe to say if kind of literary fiction is also a genre? Are there markers in everything when we're reading? Because this is a whole reader's series where we go, oh, that's for me because I can notice these things in the story. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, if you ever want to start a fight, tell a literary fiction author that literary fiction is a genre. I've seen this happen lots of times. It hasn't always been me doing the talking. Sometimes I've just been observing. But this is an idea that I think many genre fiction people are like, yeah, of course literary fiction is a genre, and literary people are like, no, don't say such a word near me. Sorry to any literary fiction writers in there, not all literary fiction authors.
Hashtag.
Yeah, hashtag. But I think a lot of the reason, like for me anyway, a lot of genre is defined by what we call paratext, which is the stuff in a book which isn't necessarily the story itself. So cover, blurb, spine, all those visual markers, front matter, back matter, where it's shelved in a bookstore, that is a form of paratext, where it is in a library, reviews, reactions, all of these are forms of paratext. And while literary fiction books might be very, very different from each other, I think there are some real commonalities in paratext. Not least, they're all shelved together, which means we can consider them as a genre. The word genre comes from the French. It literally just means category. People often get really intense about what is and isn't a genre. Another fight on which I come down on a very controversial side is in the children's literature space, which is YA is not a genre, and I'm like, nah, it is though.
Yeah. Like, thanks for coming, but it is. Yeah.
It's not a genre in that it doesn't have any defined plot elements. You can write whatever you want in YA as long as it has YA characters. But in terms, as a sorting function, as a classification function, it's definitely a category. And category is the same as genre. Like, genre doesn't have to be about plot. Otherwise, how would we define fantasy? Like, fantasy doesn't have a set plot. It has common plots, but you can do whatever you want as long as something fantastical happens. So, anyway, I can talk about that for also 100 hours. So if anyone wants to fight me about YA not being a genre, we can do that later.
Exactly. Should we at the bar? I wanted to ask you as well, you know, it seems that when we're thinking about, when we were on the phone before tonight, you talked to me about there was great dinosaur romance in 2014. It was a great series. Never forget. I didn't know about it, but I learned about it.
And what a time to be alive.
And we talked about werewolves and vampires, which were very mainstreamed, and there are a lot of those kinds of stories as well, which are more acceptable. But it seems to be when you think about what people struggle with, or when people think that something's kind of culturally acceptable or not acceptable, it seems to be that things that are escapist or that have an escapist storyline seem to be considered sort of lowbrow one way or another. Can you sort of talk about and debunk that for us a bit?
Yeah, so this is a very, very old school of thought, which is realism versus romance. And I don't mean romance in the sense of genre romance here, but this is the way romance was used as a term in sort of the 16th through to the 18th centuries, which just meant anything that wasn't realist. So it was either real or it was fantastical. It was romance. It didn't necessarily have to be about love, but it wasn't real. And the realist novel, which was mostly written by men, was perceived as very improving, very educative. Whereas the romantic novel, that would ruin your brain. There's a wonderful quote I found when I was researching for my PhD from a letter to the editor in 1730. And it was about the romances of Aproben, Eliza Haywood, and Della Riviere Manley, so a group of female authors often referred to as the Fair Triumvirate of Wit, which I think is just a great band name. But this letter to the editor said that romances ruin more virgins than masquerades or brothels. Like the idea that women will be harmed by their reading.
But there's a pull quote, right? You want to use that, definitely.
Yeah, well, I mean, it came to me like 250 years later. Yeah. Well, more than 250 years later, so go off, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this idea that if something is escapist or it's not grim realism, this has a long literary history. But the follow-up has got to be, why is escape bad? Should that woman in World War II working in the factories have to only read like grim realist literature? That's not doing anything for her. And the best author who's ever written about this, I think, is a little guy, might have heard of him. He's called J.R.R. Tolkien. In a wonderful essay he wrote called On Fairy Stories, which was the term he used for fantasy, he was like, we shouldn't think about it as fleeing, but it's the prisoner being able to escape his jail. And, you know, when real life is really hard and bad and sad, e.g. a pandemic is happening, why would you deny people the pleasures of escapist fiction? That's just mean, really. Like, so yeah, this idea that only realism is good and will improve you and make you better, and escapism is bad somehow, I do not think that is true. So that is an assumption to put pressure on.
And also presupposes that we all like doing the same thing over and over again. Like, I like eating chips. I don't want to eat chips every day, or broccoli every day. I don't only want to read, I love reading, I do read space operas, romance space operas, but they're not the only thing I want to read. I love that variety of things.
Yeah, I've read every single Ice Planet Barbarians book. They're like Doritos. Do I want to eat Doritos all the time? Will I eat a whole bag if it's put in front of me? Absolutely. Did I blink and read 38 Ice Planet Barbarians books in a row? I did, yeah. There's no point to prevaricating on that one.
Before we get to your questions, which we're going to have some time for in a moment, what I wanted to do, though, is, you were talking about what do you give people when times are uncertain and times are hard. And during a pandemic, Jodi, you gave us not one but two fabulous books, which are rom-coms. So I want you to take people through the Marry Me Juliet series. It starts with Here for the Right Reasons, and we meet Cecilia and Dylan. And I have to tell you that Jodi's done something really unusual. She's created two lead characters who are equally as charming and engaging as each other.
Oh, thank you.
And I don't know if you notice this when you're reading stuff. Often when I read, say, the Outlander books, the Diana Gabaldons, the male lead's really interesting, and the female lead, she's a great straight man, right? She's like the arrow that just takes you straight through the narrative, but she didn't seem as nuanced. She didn't seem as complicated. She didn't seem as enthralling to me often, and I wonder about what that is. But Jodi's really managed to find these two characters who are unusual and who you go, oh, I think they might like each other. But still, you're still completely enthralled as you go through it. So I want you to talk a little bit about both of those characters, where they came from, and also Dylan in particular, because he's an unusual romantic lead, I think. He's kind of fumbling, he has anxiety attacks. Where did he come from for you?
Well, so I conceived of this book during Melbourne's long lockdown in 2020. Don't know if you know this, but it sucked. I realised at one point...
We were here walking to the beach, drinking lattes, complaining, I think. No, we weren't. It was hard. We weren't doing that at all. We weren't. None of us were.
I realised at one point I hadn't touched another person for 7 months, and I was like, oh, that's probably psychologically unhealthy. That's probably done something to me. So I wanted to almost embody some of that, like, anxiety that we felt around the pandemic, and often that kind of, like, I don't want to suggest mental illness is a weakness, because it's not, but these kind of, like, weaknesses are not ones that are often ascribed to romantic heroes. And so I was like, oh, what if him and not her is the one that's, struggling? Yeah. And I knew I wanted to write in the Bachelor world, because a big part of my I've spent, like, 7 years now writing about the Bachelor, because it's about love, and I studied that. And I was watching the COVID season of The Bachelor and kind of didn't think it was very good, and I was like, oh, what would I do? And thus this book series was born. But could there be a more anxiety-inducing position than being The Bachelor? Particularly if you are, like Dylan is, just a really nice person. Like, being The Bachelor means rejecting people. It means, like, having to let people down constantly. It means having to break hearts. And Dylan is the nicest boy. He's such a cinnamon roll. Like, I really like nice heroes in romance. It's one of my favourites. So I was like, this is part of fiction writing is putting your characters in the toughest situation for them. And I was like, oh, who is it going to be so difficult to be The Bachelor for? And that was where Dylan came from. And then by the same token, Cece, who is the heroine of this book, I'm like, okay, she has to somehow end up on The Bachelor, but it has to be just the worst possible place for her to be. And so Cece is someone with intense anxiety around money because of her past. Because she grew up in extreme poverty, basically. She loses her job during the pandemic. She has no safety net to fall back on. Being on The Bachelor pays $100 a day. And so she's like, fine, I'll suck it up. I'll do it. But she cannot deal with being the centre of attention. So when the cameras turn on her, she freezes, and Dylan, out of kindness mostly, eliminates her on the first night. But twist, no one's allowed to leave the set because it's lockdown now, surprise. And so, of course, this Bachelor, who in this book, he's the Romeo in this book for copyright reasons, mostly. The show's called Marry Me Juliet, but he's a Bachelor. He falls in love with a contestant he eliminates on the first night, which I figured that's the most unlikely pairing. And then in Can I Steal You for a Second, which is the second book, which came out a couple of weeks ago, it's set on that same season of Marry Me Juliet, of The Bachelor, but we see it from a completely different perspective. So it's about two contestants who have stayed in the game. They're going right to the end, competing for this Dylan's heart. But they're two contestants falling in love. They're supposed to be falling in love with boy Dylan over here, but oh dear, they fell in love with each other and they haven't been eliminated. And then the third one, which comes out in December, is between the villain and the showrunner. So the
villain, if you haven't read the book series, is called Lily Fireball.
Yeah.
She's a fantastic bitch. She's a real bitch. She redefines what it means to be unpleasant.
The first two books are about really nice people, and then I'm like, okay, these two people are not nice at all.
So what's it like, though, to write these really, they're not bad people, right? They're not sociopaths. So what's it like to write not nice people in this rom-com space where we kind of like reading about nice people?
It's been a really interesting challenge. And so the line I've set myself, like I've literally got it on a post-it on my desk, is that neither Murray nor Lily are nice, but they're not inherently bad. And I think there's a difference between this. Like, there's a very common romance trope, actually, called grumpy sunshine. And it works really well when
That's
someone...
a band name, by the way.
Yeah. When someone is grumpy but they've justified reasons. If they're grumpy because they're just a bit of a bastard, then the book doesn't land. And so these two people are not nice because of, like, well, Murray, for instance, he's a reality TV producer. If he was nice, he would never get anything done. He wouldn't get his show made. But he's not bad. And so that's the tightrope I have to walk. And also they're as mean as each other. So it's not like I've got one who is like really not nice all the time and then someone who's just taking it. They're kind of like morally grey, grumpy and amoral sunshine is the dynamic I would describe for Murray and Lily. That one you have to wait for December for, but yeah, Can I Steal You for a Second is much more friends to lovers, and they are both quite nice.
Yeah, they are. And I should say as well that the Valentine Series, which is the one we mentioned before, which is the Scary Fairies, which is it's a slightly younger characters in that. Again, two very equally interesting and different lead characters, Pearl and Finn, who both, I have to say, they go on a journey, because they do go on journeys, literally and metaphorically. And again, you've written a really lovely guy. He's a really charming kind of, and so is she. She's, more immature at the start of the book, but she's fractious and she's nuanced and she's complicated and she's bitchy and she's earnest. And I wondered, when you talked about Lily Fireball writing this character who can be really unpleasant at times.
She's a diva. Lily,
she's a real diva. And she draws everybody else into it, especially when she knows the cameras are on her. Whether you kind of grappled with that whole thing about characters having to be relatable or likeable.
Well, I was hoping I had established enough capital with Lily. We'll see whether this is true or not. That everyone will be like, no, tell me more about this wonderful bitch.
Yeah.
Rather than, well, she's not very nice, is she?
Yeah.
Because I think the fact that she is so outrageously bitchy, and there are reasons which we will see in that book. You'll have to wait and see. But exploring kind of that inner world of someone who is much more blunt than I would ever be. It's been a really interesting writing challenge.
Beautiful. I think this is a good moment to turn the lights up a bit, and our lovely Hayley has a microphone and we have time for your questions. So we're just going to get the lights up for a sec. So if you have a question, do you want to pop your hand up? There's a question at the back. John's just going to turn the lights up for us. There we go. Thank you. There's a question at the back, but we just do need a mic. Here it is, coming to you now. Thanks, Hayley. Oh, there you are. Yep, all good.
G'day, Jodi. I've noticed you've been referring to Here for the Right Reasons as a rom-com. Can you just talk a bit about the distinction between rom-coms and romance in your view?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have some thoughts on this academically. So the term rom-com, I think, was popularized in books directly out of film. And it first came about as a publishing term as a replacement for chick lit. So I think it was applied to quite different books. Chick lit is romance adjacent, but it's not romance, because the focus in chick lit is often more about kind of female self-development, and there's a really strong romantic subplot, but it's not necessarily the main plot. But then with the popularity of Sally Thorne's The Hating Game, this is where I think this term really took off. I think the way it's used now is much less in this chick lit-y film sense. Now I think it often just means contemporary romance. It's particularly if you see books from 10 years ago being rejacketed. There was a really interesting example I saw on Twitter this week of a book called Losing It by Cora Carmack, which came out in 2012, and it was part of the boom of New Adult, which was basically originally pitched as YA, but everyone's at university, and then kind of turned into a form of contemporary romance where they were 20, 22, maybe associated with a university campus. And so it had a very of-the-time New Adult cover, and it's just been rejacketed in the classic, like my two, the cartoon cover rom-com style. So I don't think there's as much of a distinction between romance and rom-com as we would like to think. I don't think there are clear rules, but I do think romance is the umbrella genre, and rom-com is something that sits beneath it. But predominantly now, I think, refers to contemporary romance. Like, you can read books marketed as romantic comedy now, which are maybe not very funny. And so you have to assume they mean comedy in, like, the traditional sense, in that they end with a wedding or a fate, and not with everyone getting stabbed horribly and lying across the stage. We're back at Renaissance Theatre. It all comes back around.
Thank you. Any other questions for Jodi? Down the front. Thanks, Hayley.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting listening to you, and you've definitely given me sparked my interest to get back into romance novels. I'm just interested in your writing of the books, the current book. Did you know it was going to be a series when you started writing, or was it as you were writing that you sort of started getting ideas for the other books?
Yeah. So this particular series I always conceived of as 3 because I wanted them to take place simultaneously. So you see the 3 books from 3 very different perspectives. So in Here for the Right Reasons, you see it from Cece's perspective, who's eliminated on the first night. In Can I Steal You for a Second, you see it from Amanda's perspective, who's a contestant who's still in the game. And then in Not Here to Make Friends, we've got the production perspective. So there are a lot of common events. They all you can totally read them apart from each other. You don't have to read all of them. But if you read them together, the puzzle box clicks together. And when I conceived of this, I was like, amazing, how cool. And writing them, I'm like, oh, this is so hard. I have to keep the continuity straight. So I will never be doing that again. But the reason I wanted to do it that way is because I've spent so many years researching the Bachelor franchise, and I was like, when I was like, oh, I want to write a Bachelor novel, I immediately had about 20 ideas all at once, and I was like, oh, I can't just write one Bachelor novel. So I went for the 3 relationships that I thought had the most conflict, which is Bachelor first night contestant, 2 contestants, and villain producer.
And how long was the process?
So often when people ask me if I research these novels, my instinct is to say no, and then I'm like, because I had the idea and I started writing very quickly, but then I have researched The Bachelor for many years. So there was kind of an accidental period of 5 years of research before all this happened. But Here for the Right Reasons was a lockdown baby. Like, I had the idea, and then I entered a fugue state for about 3 weeks, and at the end, there was a draft of a book. I want to emphasize I edited it for much longer than 3 weeks. I have never written like that in my life before. I will probably never write like that again. It was a real, like, I've been inside this apartment for so long and something's happened to my brain moment. So Can I Steal You for a Second took about 3 months to write, and then Not Here to Make Friends, because it's the last one and the most complicated one, that's taken about 6 months.
That sounds very quick.
Yeah, I mean, you do get more practiced, but it's amazing how motivating a contract can be. Like my first novel, I spent years on, like, a book which was technically my 4th novel, Libby Lawrence Is Good at Pretending, was actually the first book I ever wrote, but I wrote it 4 times. From the ground up over 15 years. When you're under contract for something, they don't like it if you take 15 years, it turns out. Not real keen on that. So yeah, deadline's very motivating.
Yeah, fantastic. Are there more questions for Jodi? Over on this side, thanks.
Thank you. You did leave us hanging with the milking the Minotaur comment.
Let's talk about Morning Glory Milking Farm.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
C.M. McAlister, I believe, is the author of that. Correct me if I'm wrong, anyone. But it's probably the most well-known of the monster fuckers. Between a Minotaur and a woman who works at a Minotaur milking farm. You can work out what that is for yourself. But it is amazingly, given that premise, very wholesome. It's a genuinely really lovely romance. Like, their romance is formed through, like, jokes and conversations during the milking process. And it's genuinely very nice. It's the strangest little contradiction of a book. But yeah, that along with Ice Planet Barbarians are probably the 2 most breakout books in this kind of monster fucker genre. But there are tons of them. Like Ruby Dixon has got a lot of imitators now, and C.M. McAlister as well. I feel like I'm getting C.M. McAlister's name wrong, so apologies for that, if that is true.
There is another one, though, that I learned about through Jodi and another colleague of Jodi's, which is about mercenary librarians.
Oh, yeah, that's
pretty great. Yeah, that's pretty great.
The prequel series to that is about a bisexual love army in a post-apocalyptic world. There is about 1 million words in that series. There's, I don't know, 9, 10, 15 maybe books in it. They're pretty good. They're really horny. I mean, they're about a bisexual love army. What do you expect? But yeah, Kit Rocha, good author.
Yeah, there we go. We've got time for 1 or 2 more questions. Just over here. Thank you.
I'm a fellow academic, so I'm going to take us back to academic discourse. Boo.
Discourse.
So much of romance novels, and I say this as a long-time reader, first-time confessor.
Welcome.
Thank you. Have those very kind of heteronormative tropes of first consummation, first declaration of love, and then either, you know, I'm going to put my child in you or we'll get married or something like that. But you mentioned very briefly about how the LGBTQIA romance novel genre is starting to emerge, and I'm particularly curious to know, are they engaging with those same tropes, or are they subverting them? Because certainly with asexual and aromantic kind of, you don't really have those kind of emotional beats that you can hear.
Those are not the happy ending, happily ever after endings.
Yeah. Actually, one of my PhD students at the moment is working on representations of asexuality. They're working on it in fantasy specifically, but there's a lot of overlap in romance. So I've actually been reading a lot about this at the moment as I read their thesis for them, because they're about to submit. Hurrah for Noah. I'm really proud of them, Noah, if you ever watch this on recording. But yeah, new tropes are being created, because this is a really emergent space, and it's having a really nice flow-on effect, I think, into straight, scare quotes, romance, in that a lot of the kind of older, I don't really like the word problematic because I think it's not very specific, but problematic tropes, for the sake of generalizing, are being blunted and subverted and played with and come at from new angles. So I think kind of the emergence of LGBTQI romance is just this incredible net good for the genre as a whole, because it's really encouraging, okay, how can we do this in a new way as a creative practice?
Lovely. There was another question down the front, I think, just down the very front here. Just down here. Thanks, Hayley.
Hi, Jodi. I am curious about dark romance. I haven't read any myself. However, I'd really like to know, do you think that there is a sense of romance as a cautionary tale? So,
look, I haven't read enough dark romance to make an authoritative claim in that space, but my sense is that it's just a lot of things turned up to 11. It's more about those extremely heightened emotions. It's like how in fantasy you can turn up the stakes to life and death, when, you know, in your own real life a situation might be much less dramatic, but you can still relate to that core emotion. This is my sense of what's happening in dark romance, is that just everything is kind of more extreme, and it almost operates as a form of fantasy novel because we're so far outside the realist paradigm in some ways, but I would have to read more to make any kind of authoritative claim. Sorry, boring scholar answer there. It's complicated.
And any other questions for Jodi? I have a question for Jodi, which is I wanted to get her to close by giving us some recommendations, because we've talked about a lot of different books tonight, other than her wonderful books, which are up the back, which I know you're going to buy many, many copies
I recommend those, by the way.
Yes, and so do I. And so do I.
Real good.
Yeah. Can you give us a space romance recommendation, a historical romance recommendation, a rom-com recommendation that isn't yours, because we've just recommended yours, and a YA?
Sure, okay. So we'll start with Space. I think one that we talked about before, Hunt the Stars by Jessie Mahalik, or Polaris Rising by anything by Jessie Mahalik. She's really on it in the space romance space, but obviously I have to be like, Ice Planet Barbarians is out there.
It's shot to the top of the list for me, frankly.
Yeah, like a friend of mine went to the Ripped Bodice in LA, which is a famous romance bookstore there, and she brought me back the first one, and I was like, oh, I will read this for a laugh, and then I didn't stop. Ever. I read them the day they come out. They're very short. They go down real easy. And thank you, Ruby.
Okay. So historical romance.
Historical romance, my favourite author in this space. Noting, I don't read as much of this as I used to. I used to read a lot of this during my PhD, but not so much now. You can't really go past Courtney Milan.
Okay.
So if that name sounds familiar to you, it might be because of the great scandal that erupted around the Romance Writers of America in 2019, where they basically imploded because of racism, and Courtney Milan was very much the victim in that situation. But she's an incredible author. She's a trained lawyer. She's a great follow on social media. I recommend that. But her books are so great.
She's Milan? Milan?
Milan, like the city. Okay. The one I would probably recommend to start with is The Duchess War, but my favourite in that series is the last one, which is called The Suffragette Scandal, where the heroine runs a radical feminist newspaper, and it rules.
Okay. A rom-com that isn't yours.
A rom-com that isn't mine. There are simply so many options. Can I do two rom-coms? So my all-time favorite go-to author, whenever someone is like, recommend me one romance author, tell me your favorite. I'm like, a favorite? I can't, there are so many. But when I'm pushed, the name I always give is Lucy Parker. She's a Kiwi author. Probably the book to start with her, you've got a couple of options, is Act Like It is the first book in her first series, which are about celebrities on the West End. So it is a fake dating romance between two actors who are in a play together. It's great. Or her most recent book is called Battle Royal, and it's essentially set on the Great British Bake Off. Okay. And it's
working.
Very, very good book. Another favourite of mine in this space is Alicia Rye. Her most recent book, I think it's her most recent book, unless she's had a new one out, is called Partners in Crime, and it is the most fabulous romp. Like, our two lead characters are exes, they get caught up together because of shenanigans in a scheme, and have to essentially do a heist together, and it's a really, really good book. I think the pitch for it was Indian matchmaking meets the movie Date Night, but in Las Vegas.
Okay, there's a lot going on. I like it.
Yeah, and all of Alicia Rye's books are really good, but that one I really loved that one.
Beautiful. And last but not least, a YA.
One that I read recently that I really loved, which is by an author who I think I'm going to claim for Australia because she went to the University of Melbourne, is This Time It's Real by Anne Leung, which is a fake dating romance that takes place in Beijing, and it's a really, really beautiful book.
Fantastic. All right. Well, and those are all on video, so you can just watch this again later and write them all down. I want to do something in reverse before I thank Jodi. I wanted to thank you all for being here tonight, and I wanted to tell you that the Readers Books and Conversation series is just getting started. So if you love tonight, we would love you to sign up to the newsletter. If you do Facebook or Instagram, you can sign up there and find out about future events. I wanted to let you know that obviously you can be buying Jodi's books at the beautiful book table at the back, and you can buy them, read them, and persuade all your friends they must be reading more rom-coms. And also to let you know that on the 25th of May, our next event is with Tasmanian author Robbie Arnott.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. That's at 8 p.m. here, and that's as part of Sydney Writers Festival. The Petersham Bowling Club is really proud to be one of the satellite events for Sydney Writers Festival, so we hope to see you here for that one as well. What I want to particularly thank Jodi for being with us tonight from Melbourne, and thank you to Simon and Schuster for making her available to us as well, but for everything you've given us tonight, the literal, the para, the meta, the romantic, for everything you've brought to life in your academic work and for your fabulous fiction. And I want to thank you, and I want to thank you all here for being here and being part of this event tonight. But please join me in thanking Jodi McAlister.